a WikiVidi documentaries production. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Enjoy. Marjory Stoneman Douglas. Marjory Stoneman Douglas was an American journalist, author, women's suffrage advocate, and conservationist known for her staunch defense of the Everglades against efforts to drain it and reclaim land for development. Moving to Miami as a young woman to work for the Miami Herald, she became a freelance writer, producing over 100 short stories that were published in popular magazines. Her most influential work was the book The Everglades, River of Grass, which redefined the popular conception of the Everglades as a treasured river instead of a worthless swamp. Its impact has been compared to that of Rachel Carson's influential book Silent Spring. Her books, stories, and journalism career brought her influence in Miami, enabling her to advance her causes. As a young woman, Douglas was outspoken and politically conscious of the women's suffrage and civil rights movements. She was called upon to take a central role in the protection of the Everglades when she was 79 years old. For the remaining 29 years of her life she was a relentless reporter and fearless crusader for the natural preservation and restoration of South Florida. Her tireless efforts earned her several variations of the nickname, Grand Dame of the Everglades, as well as the hostility of agricultural and business interests looking to benefit from land development in Florida. She received numerous awards, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and was inducted into several halls of fame. Douglas lived to 108, working until nearly the end of her life for Everglades restoration. Upon her death, an obituary in The Independent in London stated, "In the history of the American environmental movement, there have been few more remarkable figures than Marjory Stoneman Douglas." Early life. Marjory Stoneman was born on April 7, 1890, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the only child of Frank Bryant Stoneman and Lillian Trefethen, a concert violinist. One of her earliest memories was her father reading to her the Song of Hiawatha, at which she burst into sobs upon hearing that the tree had to give its life in order to provide Hiawatha the wood for a canoe. She was an early and voracious reader. Her first book was Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, which she kept well into adulthood until some fiend in human form must have borrowed it and not brought it back. She visited Florida when she was 4, and her most vivid memory of the trip was picking an orange from a tree at the Tampa Bay Hotel. From there she and her parents embarked on a cruise from Tampa to Havana. When she was 6, Marjory's parents separated. Her father endured a series of failed entrepreneurial ventures, and the instability caused her mother to move them abruptly to the Trefethen family house in Taunton, Massachusetts. She lived there with her mother, aunt, and grandparents, who did not get along well and consistently spoke ill of her father, to her dismay. Her mother, whom Marjory characterized as high-strung, was committed to a mental sanitarium in Providence several times. Her parents' separation and the contentiousness of her mother's family caused her to suffer from night terrors. She credited her tenuous upbringing with making her a skeptic and a dissenter for the rest of her life. As a youth, Marjory found solace in reading, and eventually she began to write. At 16 she contributed to the most popular children's publication of the day, Street Nicholas magazine, also the first publisher of 20th-century writers F. Scott Fitzgerald, Rachel Carson, and William Faulkner, with a puzzle titled Double Beheadings and Double Curtailings. In 1907, she was awarded a prize by the Boston Herald for An Early Morning Paddle, a story about a boy who watches a sunrise from a canoe. As her mother's mental health deteriorated, Marjory took on more responsibilities, eventually managing some of the family finances and gaining a maturity imposed upon her by circumstance. Education and marriage. Marjory left for college in 1908, despite grave misgivings about her mother's mental state. Her aunt and grandmother shared her concerns, but recognized that she needed to leave in order to begin her own life. She was a straight-A student at Wellesley College, graduating with a BA in English in 1912. She found particular success in a class on elocution, and joined the first suffrage club with 6 of her classmates. She was elected class orator, but was unable to fulfill the office since she was already involved in other activities. During her senior year while visiting home, her mother showed her a lump on her breast. Marjory arranged the surgery to have it removed. After the graduation ceremony, Her aunt informed her it had metastasized, and within months her mother was dead. The family left the funeral arrangements up to Marjory. After drifting with college friends through a few jobs to which she did not feel well suited, Marjory Stoneman met Kenneth Douglas in 1914. She was so impressed with his manners and surprised at the attention he showed her that she married him within 3 months. He portrayed himself as a newspaper editor, and was 30 years her senior. But the marriage quickly failed when it became apparent he was a con artist. The true extent of his duplicity Marjory did not entirely reveal. Despite her honesty in all other matters, Douglas was married to Marjory while already married to another woman. While he spent 6 months in jail for passing a bad check, she remained faithful to him. His scheme to scam her absent father out of money worked in Marjory's favor when it attracted Frank Stoneman's attention. Marjory's uncle persuaded her to move to Miami and end the marriage. In the fall of 1915, Marjory Stoneman Douglas left New England to be reunited with her father, whom she had not seen since her parents' separation. Shortly before that, her father had married Lilias Eleanor Shine, a great-great-granddaughter of Thomas Jefferson. Marjory later wrote that Shine remained my first and best friend all my life in Florida. The Miami Herald. Douglas arrived in South Florida when fewer than 5,000 people lived in Miami, and it was no more than a glorified railroad terminal. Her father, Frank Stoneman, was the first publisher of the paper that later became the Miami Herald. Stoneman passionately opposed the governor of Florida, Napoleon Bonaparte Broward, and his attempts to drain the Everglades. He infuriated Broward so much that when Stoneman won an election for circuit judge, Broward refused to validate the election, so Stoneman was referred to as judge for the rest of his life without performing the duties of one. Douglas joined the newspaper's staff in 1915. She began as a society columnist writing about tea parties and society events, but news was so slow she later admitted to making up some of her stories. Somebody would say, "Who's that Mrs. T.Y. Washrag you've got in your column?" And I would say, "Oh, you know, I don't think she's been here very long." When her father went on vacation less than a year after her arrival in Miami, he left her the responsibility of the editorial page. She developed a rivalry with an editor at the Miami Metropolis whose greater familiarity with Miami history gave her cause to make fun of Douglas in writing. Her father scolded her to check her facts better. Douglas was given an assignment in 1916 to write a story on the first woman from Miami to join the U.S. Naval Reserve. When the woman did not show up for the interview, Douglas herself joined the Navy as a yeoman first class. It did not suit her. She disliked rising early, and her superiors did not appreciate her correcting their grammar, so she requested a discharge and joined the American Red Cross, which stationed her in Paris. She witnessed the tumultuous celebrations on the Rue de Rivoli when the armistice was signed and cared for war refugees. Seeing them displaced and in a state of shock, she wrote, "helped me understand the plight of refugees in Miami 60 years later." After the war, Douglas served as assistant editor at the Miami Herald. She gained some renown for her daily column, The Galley, becoming something of a local celebrity. She amassed a devoted readership and attempted to begin each column with a poem. The Galley was topical and went in any direction Douglas chose. She promoted responsible urban planning while Miami saw a population boom of 100,000 people in a decade. She wrote supporting women's suffrage, civil rights, and better sanitation while opposing prohibition and foreign trade tariffs. Some of the stories she wrote spoke of the region's wealth as being in its inevitable development, and she supplemented her income with $100 a week from writing copy advertisements that praised the development of South Florida, something she would reconsider later in her life. In the 1920s she wrote, "Martin Tabbitt of North Dakota is walking Florida now," a ballad lamenting the death of a 22-year-old vagrant who was beaten to death in a labor camp. It was printed in the Miami Herald, and read aloud during a session of the Florida legislature, which passed a law banning convict leasing in large part due to her writing. "I think that's the single most important thing I was ever able to accomplish as a result of something I've written," she wrote in her autobiography. Freelance writer. After quitting the newspaper in 1923, Douglas worked as a freelance writer. From 1920 to 1990, Douglas published 109 fiction articles and stories. One of her first stories was sold to the pulp fiction magazine Black Mask for $600. 40 of her stories were published in the Saturday Evening Post. One, Story of a Homely Woman, was reprinted in 1937 in the Post's Best Short Stories compilation. Recurring settings in her fiction were South Florida, the Caribbean, and Europe. During World War I, her protagonists were often independent, quirky women or youthful underdogs who encountered social or natural injustices. The people and animals of the Everglades served as subjects for some of her earliest writings. Plumes, originally published in the Saturday Evening Post in 1930, was based on the murder of Guy Bradley, an Audubon Society game warden, by poachers. Wings was a non-fiction story, also first appearing in the Post in 1931, that addressed the slaughter of Everglades wading birds for their feathers. Her story, Peculiar Treasure of a King, was a second-place finalist in the O. Henry Award competition in 1928. During the 1930s, she was commissioned to write a pamphlet supporting a botanical garden called An Argument for the Establishment of a Tropical Botanical Garden in South Florida. Its success caused her to be in demand at garden clubs, where she delivered speeches throughout the area, then to serve on the board to support the Fairchild Garden. She called the garden one of the greatest achievements for the entire area. Douglas became involved with the Miami Theater and wrote some one-act plays that were fashionable in the 1930s. One, The Gallows Gate, was about an argument between a mother and father regarding the character of their son who is sentenced to hang. She got the idea from her father, who had witnessed hangings when he lived in the West and was unnerved by the creaking sound of the rope bearing the weight of the hanging body. The play won a state competition, and eventually $500 in a national competition after it was written into 3 acts. With William W. Muir, husband of reporter Helen Muir, she authored Storm Warnings, a play loosely based on the life of mobster Al Capone. Some of Capone's henchmen showed up at the theater, adding an extra tingle for the audience that night, though no actual problems arose. Douglas wrote the foreword to the Work Projects Administration's Guide to Miami and Environs, published in 1941 as part of the Federal Writers Project's American Guide series. Douglas served as the book review editor of the Miami Herald from 1942 to 1949, and as editor for the University of Miami Press from 1960 to 1963. She released her first novel, Road to the Sun, in 1952. She wrote 4 novels, and several non-fiction books on regional topics included Florida birdwatching and David Fairchild, a biologist who imagined a botanical park in Miami. Her autobiography, Marjory Stoneman Douglas, Voice of the River, was written with John Rothschild in 1987. She had been working on a book about W.H. Hudson for years, traveling to Argentina and England several times. It was incomplete when she died in 1998. Brought to you by WikiVidi Documentaries. Would you like to know more?